Okay, well, welcome back to another Fireside Chat with the Xperts. This week, we have our good friend Phil Stoten with us. He is the founder of Scoop. He's an experienced technologist, journalist, and a very good moderator. So I know Bill's been on his shows several times. I've had many interactions with him over the years. He also has a column called What's the Scoop on EMS Now. So definitely check that out. Welcome, Phil.
Hey, good to see you. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, it's fun to have the boot on the other foot to have Bill asking the question. So I shall resist the temptation to interview anybody today.
Yeah, I believe you're allowed 0 questions today.
There you go. Okay. Well, I'm relaxed. I'm sat here on the beach, taking the sunshine in, so it's all good.
Perfect. Cool. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Scoop and founding the company?
Yeah, I guess for anybody that doesn't know me or doesn't know Scoop, Scoop kind of came out of my work I was doing with various different publications, editing and publishing content. A realization, I guess, that people were struggling to produce that content and to have a really good content strategy, and started helping out advertisers and kind of selling content alongside advertising for the various different publications I'd worked with and had set up over the years. And then it kind of span off into a separate business, initially as a turnkey and a marketing company with full services, but then focusing on that one thing of content. And we use the slogan, all about content. And I guess that's because I feel that's what we're really good at and what we're uniquely positioned to do. So, you mentioned a technologist. I always consider myself a generalist, not a specialist. So I can talk about all kinds of different topics. And what we do is we help our clients tell their story against a backdrop of what's going on in the market, and we help get them published in the publications they want to be in. So I write for Forbes, I write for Entrepreneur, I write for EMS Now, and it's great to hear the 3 of those in the same sentence. But we have other writers on the team, and we write for a whole bunch of publications. I think in the last month we've been in Robotics 247. We've been in several supply chain magazines. We've had pieces that we've ghostwritten in the Wall Street Journal, kind of anywhere and everywhere. And obviously the other element is the video content. We used to do that at trade shows. We now do that on the beach, which is great. I'm good with that. And yeah, it's great to see more of this stuff actually. And I've enjoyed watching this show. And when I was asked to come on, I went and watched a few episodes, and I enjoyed watching Phil Zorro, which is always an entertaining guy to watch, and Mike Conrad and these folks that I've seen. And this morning I watched the solar one, which actually I thought was really good, the whole energy debate. So yeah, some neat stuff.
I was just wondering how much it costs to set up your booth on the beach. It must be a fortune.
There you go. Yeah, it's actually a piece of green fabric. I didn't even shout for a whole green screen. I went to the local fabric store and picked a color. I've got another piece of green fabric that's the wrong color, that doesn't work because it's clearly too close to the color of my eyes, and I look like this demonic person with whatever I've got behind me in my eyes as well. So we fixed that, but yeah, it works pretty good actually. And I spend a bit of time in the studio, so very happy with that.
Now, how did Forbes happen? I mean, that's a huge deal, right? Top Trip magazine.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, I guess with Forbes, they have criteria for writers, and I've often pitched other writers to them. And in fact, we just hired a new senior partner at Scoop, a guy called Marco Nunziata, who is a senior contributor for Forbes. He was formerly the chief economist of GE, and he worked for the World Economic Forum before that. And he's done a TED Talk, which is always something I'd like to do. I don't like TED Talks online; they don't seem to work as well. But the original format with the round red carpet.
Course, yeah.
Maybe I'll just have to buy the carpet and do my own TED Talks.
Little clicker. You got to go for it.
Yeah, But yeah, there's an application process and a vetting process, and they look at the content that you've published, and they look at the work that you've done over quite a long period. And they, it's kind of like you just get an email saying yes or no, and it's as simple as that. There's no appeal, there's no anything. So, and it's been a fun one to write for, as has Entrepreneur Magazine. I really like that one. And Bill, I like writing about technology, but I like writing about the kind of bigger trends that exist around that. What's going on, what's moving and shaking the industry. And at the moment, we're in this time of huge change. So having access to the Forbes audience, the entrepreneurial audience, as well as all the trade press audience is fantastic for someone that likes to shoot from the hip and is opinionated like I am. So, I'm pretty strict when I'm writing for other people. But when I'm writing for myself, I can just, like I say, just shoot from the hip and tell it the way I see it. And there are some challenges ahead in the industry, and it's interesting to see how we meet those challenges and face up to them.
See, that's Australia rubbing in and an Englishman, right? That's what it is.
Yeah. I've been in Australia. I've been in Australia for over a year, which is the longest I've been in one country for over 30 years.
That's incredible.
So it's just it's been crazy, but yeah, I have been very lucky. I can't think of a better place to have been trapped through the whole pandemic than here. And like I was saying to you off camera, we've just shut the border with, just closed the connection to Brisbane in Queensland because they've got like 7 cases, and in Victoria we're 30 plus days straight without a single COVID case. So, whilst the world is rushing to get people vaccinated, we've been able to be a little bit more thoughtful and a bit slower with that process. And with the approval of vaccines and the rollout of vaccines, we've been able to be a bit more strategic. But we did a really strict shutdown last year for like 15 weeks. We stayed home, and that seemed to help a lot. We're an island, we're isolated, so that's a big benefit. But yeah, it's been a good place to be this last 12 months.
And this is what's interesting, right? Because this experience for the past year, and we just had our first anniversary of the lockdown. Lockdown happened here March 19th. It showed that you are not an island, right? I mean, you were a guy that I met at every trade show out there, right? You were traveling. I don't know how many months a year you're traveling, but you're always traveling in Europe, Asia, in Americas, and it's been fascinating to see your perspective on how work has changed due to COVID, right? Because I was like talking to you because you have this bigger pictures, the biggest perspective based on everyone you talk to, and so what's the future for us?
Well, the future for us, I actually wrote a piece at the weekend for Forbes, and I kind of focused on 2 areas: what's changing in manufacturing and what's changing in the marketing of manufacturing. And they're really, they're obviously very closely connected. But this whole idea of globalization has been seriously challenged by this whole process. 1, because we can't travel. 2, because supply chain has been impacted by everything. We say the pandemic was the biggest disruption, but before that we had the trade wars and tariffs and all that kind of stuff going on. Now we have a big semiconductor shortage. We just had a ship backed up in the Suez Canal that it's going to impact the supply chain for a whole bunch of stuff. Actually, it's surreal. So it's just like disruption, and there are going to be more of those. So, there's a challenge to the manufacturing industry, and if we see a reversal in globalization and a trend towards more domestic supply chains, more supply chain security, then I think that has a big impact on the way we run our businesses and the way we think about the products we buy and the way we make those products. And then on the marketing side, switched emphasis completely to these digital strategies, to these online strategies. We've been trying, I think for 10 years, we were messing about with the idea of a virtual trade show. And I thought 2 years ago, we realized it was crap and it didn't work. And then suddenly we had to do them. So suddenly they're everywhere. And for me, the big tests last year were what would happen to the huge shows like the Hanover Fair and Electronica.
Yeah.
And then when we come into this year, what would happen to the big shows that I always went to at the start of the year, like starting with CES and then South by Southwest.
Yeah.
And to my mind, they've worked in delivering content, thought leadership content. And, as I said before, we're all about content, and that's what we're focused on. But what they haven't worked is in that, in that kind of trade show way. There wasn't a great way of, even with CES, which I felt, these guys have got deep pockets, they've got huge sponsors. They're going to be able to make this thing work. And I went on and I watched the keynotes and stuff, and it wasn't that much different to this. It was guys in studios and guys in studios with bigger budgets, but still just guys in studios, no live audience. But it was a good way to see content. You could watch it on demand. You didn't have to rush around from, one press event to another press event during CES. But you didn't get any of that show floor vibe that you got. So for me, CES was always 3 days of press conferences at the beginning. And then I would just pick a topic and say, okay, today I'm going to look at robotics. And I would just walk the show floor in the robotics area and just meet people and chat to them and find stuff out, and then write a piece based on that. And there isn't a good way of doing that. So you've got to kind of change the way you network and change the way you communicate. So yeah, I think we've seen a huge change. And I think that change is continuing. And I don't see us going back to all of those same old habits. I don't see trade shows coming back in the same way. And I've talked to people that have said about trade shows, we're glad we didn't have to go to that one this year. Some of the response is, now nobody's going to that one. We don't feel bad about not going. And, you and I have discussed this before, Bill, when people first started canceling trade shows, one of the first things we did within Scoop was say to customers and prospects, hey, come to us with your trade show deliverables and let's figure out how we can generate that number of leads, make sure you have that number of thought leadership opportunities, make sure you have that amount of media liaison, make sure you have that amount of communication with your customers about new products without a trade show and with probably a lower budget. And I always say, I always start with, what leads did you generate from that show last year? And when they start with, well, not many, or these, but they didn't really turn into anything, you know that the model was perhaps fundamentally flawed. And so much of the show budget doesn't go to the organization putting on the show. It goes to, carpet, drayage, local hotels. And, that industry needs to exist in some way, but is it delivering value in terms of your marketing dollars? I don't know. So, yeah, I think, there's a lot of rethinking been going on over the last 12 months. And I think as we come out, the results of that are going to be really interesting.
Yeah, so I want to pick on that in the article that you wrote about marketing and manufacturing, right? And we've had these conversations in the past, and you are a more optimistic person than I am, right? You come from a perspective that people actually learn from mistakes and from events. I'm more skeptic on their ability to actually learn and change their behaviors. And if you think about black swan events, right? You say, oh, COVID was a black swan. The ship in the Suez Canal, that's a black swan.
There's a lot of black swans out there.
At which point do you figure out it's not a black swan anymore, right? The supply chain disruptions are a reality. And what I see is like this, we're going to have a split, right? You have companies that are going to be prepared for the next interruptions, or they're going to do what you said, which is to strategize, re-energize local supply chains so they are less susceptible to these events. And companies who want to just say, you know what are the chances it's going to happen again?
Yeah.
Let's keep rolling. How do you see that divide actually playing out in our industry?
Yeah, I think and in some ways, I think it is a bit generational. And there is this old school thing of, we've always done it that way. It works that way. Once we can get back to doing what we do, then everything will be okay again. So there's a tendency to think of that. And then there's a younger generation that are being a bit more revolutionary rather than evolutionary, and are saying, okay, we have to have stuff that's digitally enabled. We have to look at the supply chain. We have to look at the systems in place to manage that. And they're the millennials that are buying stuff online, that want tracking, that want to be able to see where stuff's being made, where stuff comes from. They're the people that are more environmentally conscious, so want to be concerned about where the raw materials are coming from and how those raw materials are being produced. So I think I see some change there. I see some government momentum, which is interesting. To see President Biden wading in on the semiconductor issue and saying, "Hey, we need to build semiconductor factories." And we all know we can put a semiconductor factory up in a couple of weeks. It's a really straightforward process, and cheap as chips would be the wrong term, but
exactly, yeah.
It's fascinating to see the governments getting involved in that. But I think supply chain security is hugely important. And actually, interestingly, we started working with some people in the rare earths side of the market, and titanium powders and lithium. And, the high-tech industry is dependent on some absolutely critical raw materials. And whilst the US and a lot of Europe has been snoozing over the last 10 or 15 years, Asia has been developing its supply chain in those areas as well. So, for example, with titanium, huge dependence on Asia and Russia and Argentina. If you were picking 3 countries to be most dependent on in terms of your supply chain, they're obviously in your top half a dozen. Yeah. So, there are some challenges there, but I think there are people that are keen to revolutionize the industry and see the benefit in terms of the big picture. And I'm optimistic about them. But, like you say, Bill, I'm permanently optimistic. And I think it's a nice way to be. I like to believe the good in people and in society generally. And I think technology can help us with a whole bunch of things. And I think that's what we need in supply chain. We need that. We need supply chains to be digitally enabled. We need them to be agile and adaptable, and we need them to be, kind of ready for the future of these industries. Because if we're going to move to EVs, which I hope we are, because it's good for the planet, then we need enough lithium to do that for the batteries. We need a huge battery storage capacity so we can move to renewable energies. There's a whole lot of things we need to change. So we need revolutionary people in the in the industry to make that happen.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this redesign of the globalization concept, right? The Marshall Plan for post-World War II, and how the world was conceived as this big global tribe where what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine, right? That was the concept. And now, once we move this digital platform, and we start talking about digital twins, and we start placing things in both our manufacturing plants online, so we can basically ship products and redesigns all over the globe. How are governments going to catch up? How are the tariffs going to catch up once we live in this digital world where cryptocurrency and this distributed manufacturing plant is easily going to optimize manufacturing in Indonesia or Mexico or Atlanta, right? In a fraction of a second. How are regulators going to catch up? They can barely understand Twitter, right?
Yeah.
How are we going to, get that far?
Well, yeah. I mean, I do think it's fascinating, and I'm always curious when I look at government policy. And obviously, we've been watching what's going on in the US because you've had an election. So, and it's been an absolutely fascinating one. And it's always interesting to try and figure out whether what the government is doing and saying reflects what's happening in terms of at the grassroots level, in terms of what the people think and what the people really want. And there's a balance there, isn't there? Because government is protective of those old industries that we know are perhaps fundamentally not good industries for the long term. You look at the coal industry, you look at the way, energy has been produced from fossil fuels. You look at the automotive industry, which employs massive amount of people with really good jobs, but is basically working around the internal combustion engine, and it's got a long way to go to convert to something better. So you look at government policy and you look at the way people think and you say, okay, are they parallel? And then you look at this globalization, maybe this globalization experiment that we've been going through, and this chasing of low-cost labor around the world, which I think doesn't make sense. And then you start to explore the digital transformation, and can we use digital transformation to create a manufacturing renaissance in the US or a manufacturing renaissance in Europe? And I'm pretty sure we're seeing some of that. But then part of that is layering in automation and autonomy. And when you do that, there's displacing jobs. So the government has to get involved there, and you have to have a good social policy to be able to figure out how to do that. So it's a very complex debate. But I think fundamentally what we have to avoid is when we look at low-cost labor, it's normally there. Low-cost labor normally exists temporarily, and it's normally in some way exploitative. Not necessarily just exploitative in terms of the low-cost labor or the people working themselves, because actually China over the last 30 years has taken 500 million people out of poverty, which is fantastic. And that's one of the positives of all those jobs going to China in manufacturing and in these other industries. So I think that's really important. But it's not just exploitative in terms of the people. It's often exploitative in terms of the environment. And, there aren't the same level of priorities in terms of what we're doing in terms of carbon emissions or what we're doing in terms of taking care of diversity and all those other issues. So there are big challenges in globalization. What we need to have, if we think about it in terms of manufacturing, is manufacturing that can operate successfully in pretty much any geography. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because everything else surely has to be temporary and not sustainable. So, when we use the word sustainability, we want that to mean sustainability in terms of the planet and the workforce, but we also want it to be sustainable in terms of it will continue to happen and it will continue to make profit. And it's not just, let's get this stuff made cheaply in Malaysia. And when Malaysia's labor rates go up too high, let's move to Vietnam or let's move somewhere else. Because that isn't sustainable. That's temporary in the same way that using fossil fuels is temporary and not sustainable. So I think we need to think about that. And I think automation and digital transformation and all those things gives us a whole bunch of opportunities, but we need to have government policy that supports that and is thoughtful of that and is not just, protectionist. How do we protect ourselves from the rest of the world? But it's clear that we are not, a single global tribe. We're a bunch of tribes that have to live and function well amongst each other and have different skill sets, and should be able to share and utilize those skills in a better way. You said I was an optimist earlier. I think I'm actually a little bit utopian as well. I've always had this idea of, kind of free movement. I've been lucky. I was, born in the UK, so I have a British passport, and that's pretty much allowed me to travel and work anywhere in the world. And if your skills are in demand, the free movement of labor pretty much exists for you. I love the idea that would exist for everybody, but it kind of doesn't, does it? So it's challenging. But yeah, I think government's got to reflect what we want as people, and I think people fundamentally want something that is sustainable and is healthy. So,
speaking of what people want, and I hope you didn't take offense when I called it optimist. It was supposed to be a compliment.
Yeah, no, I take it exactly as that. I am an optimist and I am utopian, and I don't mind that.
Yeah. What if you had a chance to talk to yourself, your 22-year-old Phil Stoten? What would you tell young Philip?
What would I tell young Philip? Invest in Zoom.
Where'd you put your time, young Philip? Your energy.
Yeah, buy some Zoom stock. Get digitally enabled. I don't know. It's interesting, and I kind of, because I'm an optimist, I tend to look very, very much forward. So I never look back and have regrets. If I look back to 22-year-old Philip, I'd say, spend more time with your dad because he's not around anymore. Those kind of things. Family, that's hugely important. I loved every single part of my kids growing up. So getting to do that again would be freaking awesome. So, that stuff's great. In terms of work and career, just do something you love. I mean, there's lots of parts of my job that I find that I think are hard work, but I love writing. I love talking to people. So, when someone invites me to be on a show, if David said he was doing a puppet show for his kids and he wanted me as a guest, I'd be, I'll do that.
Oh, no,
as long as I'm on credits, I'm happy. So, that would, what would I tell myself in terms of, the way you work in the industry? I don't know, because I look at people that I've worked with for years and years that have made millions, and some of them that haven't done so well. And it's not as if the ones that have made millions are the happiest ones. They tend to be the ones that get to spend less time with their family, get to go home less often. At the moment, people should enjoy the fact that they get to work at home. I've had conversations with you, Bill, where you've been in your garage and the kids are running around, and it just, that looks like a lot more fun than being at the office every day.
Or in an airplane flying around. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I don't know. Yeah, just have fun and enjoy it. Every time you have a career switch, think about that. Think about, let's not jump out of this frying pan into this fire and do the same again. And, just do it with a different branded shirt on. But let's think about what we want to do with our life and our time, and, try and do something different and something that's valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think,
what about you, Bill? What did you tell you've asked everybody this question. You must have an idea of what you tell 22-year-old Bill. I mean, that's only like 5 years ago, I know, but
like 2 years ago.
What would you tell 22-year-old Bill?
No, actually, David is a millennial, so I missed by a couple of years. It's a good question. I think I left home fairly early. I moved to the US from Brazil, and my parents stayed there. I visited them again a couple months ago, when it was January. And, spending time with family, I think, would be what I recommend the most. And, we usually say that, do what you love, right? And you don't, and that will lead to success. And I have a tendency of, I think that you got to do what you're good at, and eventually you're going to love it because you're going to be good at it, right?
Yeah.
And do that, you're going to fall in love, because for example, very successful tax accountant, right? No one is in love with that. But if you're good enough and you make a lot of money, you're gonna fall in love with it. So and that's I was fortunate that I very early in my life I fell in love with electronics and tinkering, and I was able to turn a hobby into a career, right?
Yeah. No, I'm 100% with you there, Bill. Do what you love, and actually, that's that. If you can do that and you can make a living, that's a reward in itself. The other thing that I just thought of, and you and I have both had the opportunity to do it a lot through our lives, but not now, is travel. I've always said to my kids, one's in London, one's in Barcelona, in Spain. Just travel as much as you can. And it's tough that you can't travel at the moment. And I wonder if that kind of sense of adventure that you get from picking up and moving to another country to work is something that's going to be difficult in the future, because that was a huge part of your life and your career, Bill, to move from somewhere where you perhaps didn't have an opportunity to somewhere where you had much more opportunity. And the fact that might get more difficult is a real negative of this, maybe shift in a view of globalization. It's just, I count myself really lucky that I've seen so much of the world, because if we get to a position where we have other viruses or other issues that make that difficult, it's going to be much harder for other generations to do that. People can't go backpacking for a year at the moment and visit 20 different countries. And that was, that's a very life expanding experience.
It really is. I mean, nothing teaches to be humble like sleeping on a train station in different, when you are 14, 15.
And it just makes you, I think it makes you appreciative of other people's lives, other people's cultures. And, you see the value in that, and you see the value in, like you say, what makes people happy, what they love, even if they are whether they're a tax accountant or they're, I don't know, high wire acrobat or whatever. They're different things, different strokes for different folks.
Or a puppet show star.
Or puppet shows, yeah.
Or puppet shows like David's new business. David, I was curious about the doors behind you. What's behind the doors?
Oh, that's a closet.
It's a closet. I am fascinated by Zoom culture.
Yeah, it's actually a green screen.
What people wear on Zoom. But what they do as their background, Bill's like the consummate corporate professional with his branded shirt and the pictures behind.
Exactly.
I'm pretty scruffy. It's 9:47 in the morning here. So I got up early, did some work, had breakfast. So, below this, I'm in my pajamas.
Thanks for keeping it off screen. I appreciate that.
And then David's almost inside the closet, but also wearing the branded stuff. I think it's fascinating to see how that's changed over the last year. And every male on the planet now has a beard, because nobody can be bothered to shave anymore.
Yeah. Exactly. We don't care.
I used to shave in the car going to work.
No, you didn't.
There you go.
Next time I drive to work, I'll shave.
No, you didn't.
Yeah. Do you know, I always wanted to do interviews in the car. I watched that James Corden carpool karaoke, and I think about 3 years before that started, when we were doing Apex in Las Vegas, I said to the guys, the crew, one of which is my son Jack, but also Connor, I said, guys, what I want to do is I want to get like a Cadillac Eldorado convertible, set it up with the cameras, and we'll just drive people down the strip to the show, and we'll interview them in the back of the car. How much fun would that be?
That would have been awesome.
And they said, no, it's too difficult. Don't you just hate that?
Too difficult.
Can't be that hard, can it?
It's easy now.
That's what these little, I don't know, helmet cameras and all this stuff's for.
Exactly. All right. Well, we are over time.
Of
I'm
course.
Attribute that to Phil asking a question. I told you not to.
I apologize.
Well, it's very good to have you on,
like 5 minutes to become the host. Do you see? He's like asking me questions.
Yeah,
It's a professional host there, you know?
He took over.
Can't help it, Bill.
Well, we'll see you again on my kids' puppet show real soon.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
On YouTube.
We're going to get working on all this stuff, or however we're going to do it.
It's synchronized with your hand and your voice. Well, Phil, very good to have you on. And Bill, always a pleasure.
Well, guys,
thanks for joining us, and we'll see you
Thanks
all
a lot.
soon.
Have a good day, Phil.
Cheers,
Bye-bye.
guys. All the best. Bye.